You know 3 things I like? Minecraft, animation, and fantasy. So naturally, I fell in love with Songs of War, a series by Black Plasma Studios which checked all 3 of those boxes. It got me hooked. Its lore, setting, and characters just immersed me in ways plenty of media fails to do. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the characters. When I first watched Season 1 and read the script for the next 2, I enjoyed most of them. But nowadays, I've come to understand that Songs of War wasn't as perfect as I used to think, and that it does have some flaws in its writing, albeit flaws that don't stop me from continuing to love the series. I went back and rewatched all my script reading videos from 2020 and realized that the characters aren't all that great either. Do I still enjoy a good selection of them? Yes, of course, but my opinions have definitely seen some major changes overall, for the better or for the worse. So today, I'll be ranking every important character in Songs of War from worst to best in my personal opinion. Of course, not all the characters are here. I'm using the Songs of War wiki as a baseline, but I've excluded a lot of the more insignificant ones as they have little to no bearing on the plot, and as such, I would have practically nothing to talk about while ranking them. Additionally, I do not count the pet characters like Sam, Luna, Kiki, anyone else of that sort. Also, a warning that this will obviously contain spoilers for Songs of War, so if you haven't seen it, do watch the first season on the Black Plasma Studios channel, and read the next 2 in the script, which I will be linking in the description. One last thing to note is that this video is purely my own opinion. Sure, I may make some statements that could be perceived as objective, such as, this character is written well, or this character is written badly, but all of that comes from my personal perspective on the script, and is by nature debatable. I won't tack an "in my opinion" onto everything I say purely because it would take you all out of the video, but effectively, that is still the case. I am not presenting this as a factually correct ranking by any means, just one that encapsulates my feelings towards these characters, and I understand that everyone's feelings vary in that regard. It is acceptable, even to an extent encouraged, for you to disagree with me. This isn't really something I should have to specify, but hey, it's the internet, gotta be safe. In other words, if your opinions do not align precisely with my own, you are an inferior human being and deserve nothing more than pain and suffering. Alright, let's get started. It is incredibly rare for me to actively hate a character with every fiber of my being. A character can be bad and all, but I can usually at least tolerate their presence. I didn't hate Rey from the Star Wars sequels because Daisy Ridley is a fantastic actress who did her best with what she was given. I do not hate the character Dream from the Dream SMP, even though I absolutely despise him as a person in real life, because there he is well written and has an intimidating presence in the story. I didn't even hate Artemis Fowl from the Artemis Fowl movie, which is one of, if not my least favorite film of all time, because while his character is completely obliterated in the adaptation, at least he is not actively a pain to watch. That's just the movie in general. But the character I'm about to talk about right here and now is someone I have nothing but genuine contempt for. Every single aspect of this character is simply awful. Of course, I'm talking about Alistair Evanstein III. I could really just stop there, because anyone who has read the script must know exactly why I hate Alistair so much. But screw it. He is just a piece of human garbage on every possible level without a single redeeming quality. He is not well written, nor is he enjoyable to read in the slightest. He is one of the most transparently obnoxious, pretentious, and blatantly evil dirtbags I have ever seen in media. And on top of that, he's a literal incel! Basically, he's an entitled rich brat who joins the Ender Knights with the intention of taking over Ardonia for himself to supposedly ensure peace and order. Real deep there, I assure you. He then acts like a scoundrel to everyone else and makes his evil intentions ridiculously clear early on to both the characters around him and the audience, and somehow, he just doesn't get called out for any of this. The closest thing we get to that before he betrays them, which is also way too easy to predict by the way, is Danny telling Abigail that he's sick of him. Like, yeah, I agree, but at this point, I don't understand why the other Ender Knights wouldn't have taken a decent amount of action against him. Whatever, man, I guess they just decide not to, because, the plot needs them not to. Then, of course, Alistair tries to seduce Abigail in a really creepy and uncomfortable manner and gets rejected immediately, so he then goes on to make the most comically sexist remarks I have ever read in the following episodes. Like, this guy is legitimately pathetic. He is the textbook definition of an incel. Damn, bro, I can't believe they made 4chan users canon to Songs of War. And in Season 2, Episode 7, we get the hilariously predictable twist villain reveal and betrayal where he turns on Abigail and stabs her, and then heads off to take over all of Ardonia. By himself. Somehow. He just flies into Crown Peak with his dragon, takes the throne, summons various government officials out of nowhere, and then forces them to kneel before him. I'm sorry, what? Don't the kingdoms have armies? Do they not have legions of soldiers to immediately oust him with? I get that he has a dragon, but come on, that still wouldn't be enough to stop the combined forces of 5, if not all 6 kingdoms. And why would a couple officials bowing to him even matter when the people would very obviously not support his leadership? Why would this plan even work? Somehow the authorities are just magically so incompetent that Abigail and the Ender Knights have to swoop in and save the day for them. The writing here is just so abysmal, and it's purely for the sake of giving Alistair a single intimidating moment, and that still doesn't work, because all he is simply a pretentious, insufferable scumbag. The only enjoyable part of his character is his death scene. The sheer burst of serotonin I received when he perished is impossible to overstate. I am so happy this god-awful prick did not survive past the second season, and I didn't have to put up with him for any longer. Alistair? More like cringe, that is all. Scorch ticks me off a good amount as well. Not nearly as much as Alistair, but he's not fun to read either, especially considering his frequent use of the word kitty when referring to Felinas, which is probably a slur to them. I guess edgy 14-year-old Discord users are also canon now. He's a huge scumbag, go figure. I don't know, man, I just don't see the appeal of characters who act like pieces of trash just for the sake of acting like pieces of trash. You at least have to give them some qualities that make them enjoyable, something that makes their dialogue fun to read. I guess at the very least, Scorch is much less sleazy than Alistair and doesn't get under my skin to the same degree, and I guess he also isn't a terribly written character like Alistair, but that's about it. He still sucks. Malachi is by far the most generic villain in the entire series. There's nothing offensively bad about him, but his entire character is basically just big bully who wants power and thinks the strong should lead the weak. I can sort of give him a pass because he didn't really need to be developed, but he still wasn't any fun to read, so he's going near the bottom of this list. There really isn't that much more to talk about with him, so moving on. The Necrolord is critically underdeveloped. Remember when I said this wasn't a big deal in Malachi's case? Well, it is here, because the Necrolord is one of the most important villains in the entire series. Right from the beginning, he has a dark, intimidating presence in Season 1. He starts off good, and then in Season 2 we get to see a little more of him, and we finally get to hear his voice. In the big epic climax where the Necromancers are invading Flora, we're treated to a pretty good plot twist in which the Necrolord is revealed to have been a Voltaris all along, and we learn his backstory and motivations. Perfect, right? Seems like they're paving the way for this guy to continue to be important and developed in the story, right? Well, screw you, because that is absolutely not happening. The moment we see even a glimpse of depth from this character, he is immediately killed off to make way for Pyphis and the Nepharans. Why? Why on God's green earth would you set up a villain like this, only to immediately cast him aside in such an unsatisfying manner? It's so incredibly frustrating. I'm putting the Necrolord a spot above Malachi on this list purely because he actually has, a character with a slight amount of depth. It just sucks that he was never really explored because the story had to make way for the Nether. Moving on. Wow, a power-hungry villain with little to no other motivations or character traits. How original. Pyphis is only slightly above Malachi and the Necrolord because his dialogue is at least fairly enjoyable, and I like his interactions with the Death Singer, aka Ingressus, but he's really just about as simple as it gets when it comes to big bad antagonists. As a character, he's most definitely far inferior to his brother Vulcanus, who has much more interesting struggles and a much more likable personality. Actually, there are a couple times when Pyphis is implied to be a little more than he seems. For one, it is established that he still has some sort of care towards Vulcanus at the start of Season 3, and actually felt betrayed when he helped Abigail, but that's pretty much as far as the script goes with that. Again, it seems like much more could have been done with him. As is, he's just another mediocre at best villain. I really, really wish I could have put Tigran higher on this list. And if we were just talking about Tigran from Season 1, I absolutely would have. But he is just so utterly ruined in the next 2 seasons that I can't. I dreaded from the very moment that I saw the Death Singer return in Season 1, Episode 10 that Tigran was going to be sidelined in his favor moving forward. And you know what happened? Exactly that. Yay. It really does suck, because Tigran was great in Season 1. He was intimidating and awesome every time he showed up, and Lucas Webley did an incredible job voicing him. While being a villainous scumbag, there was a lot more to him than that basic archetype, with him having gained the responsibility of leading the Voltaris in the Death Singer's absence, and seeking vengeance against Phalius, someone who slaughtered many of his comrades in the past. All that stuff. As such, he was interesting, and I enjoyed watching him a lot. But then Season 2 happened. Season 2 completely ruins everything that made Tigran a good villain. He immediately takes a backseat to the Death Singer once he returns and lacks the intimidating presence he had in the previous season, and pretty much just meanders about the entire time with barely any impact on anything that's happening around him. I get that Ingressus is a lot more important by now, and he's a far better character anyway, but that doesn't mean they had to sideline Tigran this much. Why couldn't they have given the two of them an actual dynamic? Why not have Tigran begin to lose faith in the Death Singer because of how fundamentally different their personalities are? Wouldn't it have been interesting if Tigran had tried to retake control of the Voltaris out of fear that Ingressus had become too soft to conquer the Ardoni? It just feels like such wasted potential. And of course, in Season 3, Tigran almost immediately dies to Sen and Rhea in an event that is ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. I will give the script credit for making his death itself pretty cool, but from a writing perspective, he still exits the story without fanfare in a disappointing manner. Tigran is a prime example of how to destroy a perfectly good antagonist. He could have been so much more, but as is, he has to go low on this list just because of how pathetic he is after season 1. Sorry Tigran, you're one of the most wasted characters I've ever seen. There has been a lot of discussion in the Songs of War fandom over the course of its lifetime about one really important female character who has a lot of problems. A character who is pretty boring and uninteresting and overall badly written, covered in mile-thick plot armor that protects her in completely illogical and nonsensical ways. For these reasons, she's one of the most heavily criticized characters in the series. And you know what? I agree. Rhea is bad. What, you thought I was gonna say Abigail, an actual compelling character with strong development who is brought down by only a couple scenes that are ultimately inconsequential? Hell no! Every single thing she is accused of being doesn't apply to her, but it does apply to Rhea, and it applies to Rhea tenfold. I'm well aware this is a hot take, so let me explain why I have the opposite, highly controversial opinion. I don't want to delve into Abigail just yet, but I'm going to go over why I think Rhea is a poorly written character. Now obviously you don't have to agree with this part, but I'm just pointing out my opinion. So, yeah, let's just get started. So Rhea is at first living a peaceful life in Sandaria alongside Sen, her adoptive brother. In the first scene she's in, Thalia shows up and gives her a song, same with Sen. Then, later in Season 1, the Voltaris attack, and she somehow manages to escape with the same song Thalius gave her. Here we have problem number 1. In the few days between these events, who the hell taught her to use that song? And how? It takes months for Sen to learn how to use his song in Season 2, so why can Rhea learn it so quickly? I suppose you could make the argument that maybe she accidentally used it and got away, but considering the Voltaris are highly skilled warriors, I don't think she could just get away by chance like that. Whatever, it's a minor issue I guess. There are far bigger ones upcoming. So in Season 2, we learn that Rhea is now the captain of a military group named the Knights of Ardonia, whose mission is to fight the Voltaris. Season 2 takes place roughly 6 months after the first. So that means that in 6 months, Rhea, with no former combat experience besides some incredibly light and playful training with Sen, somehow became skilled enough to lead the KOA. I don't buy it. To make matters worse, it's not like she just joined the group early and rose up the ranks gradually. She was captain from the very beginning, and I have the director's commentary to confirm that.
She basically started the Knights of Ardonia, this small group. Hubris was the first one to kind of join, and then her and Hubris went out and started trying to recruit new people.
I do not understand why anyone in the KOA follows her leadership. Hubris seems like the much more obvious choice for a captain, but if not him, why not a Killian, aka the Tidesinger, once he shows up later on in Season 2? It's not just that she shouldn't realistically be as skilled as she is, it's also that she doesn't seem to have any regard for her troops. We never really get to see her connect on a personal level with anyone in the KOA, besides with Hubris on a very minimal level, and even then it's more so him trying to connect with her and not the other way around. Compare her to Abigail, who was very explicitly established to care greatly for her fellow Ender Knights, seeing them as great friends and being impacted severely when Denny dies midway through Season 3, even going so far as to risk her own life trusting Volcanus and falling into what could potentially be an obvious trap just to get a chance at saving Saxon and Trevor. Has Rhea actually had any heroic moments like that? Has she directly done anything significant to benefit her followers? I honestly can't recall anything of the sort. In fact, she barely seems to regard the deaths of multiple KOA members, like Onyx and Masani for instance. Does she genuinely care? She's never really kind to anyone besides Sen. Props to her for being one of the only Ardoni to accept Voltaris, but that's kind of a low bar, and it's also about where it ends. All of these problems just make her incredibly unlikable. Maybe if she grew past them or learned the error of her ways, I would have ranked her higher, but that just didn't happen. Why not establish that the reason she disregards her troops so much is because of her obsession with vengeance against Tigran for killing her family, and then when Tigran dies, she learns that she should have spent more time connecting with them, and makes an effort to do so now that her objective is complete. But no, screw you. Let's not give one of our main characters an actual arc. We can just have her remain pretty much the exact same for an entire 2 seasons. She doesn't grow past her basic motivations and traits, and learns nothing. I'm sorry, this is just how I see things. If you like Rhea, I have no objection to that. I just can't feel the same way myself. Solomon isn't really bad, but he also isn't good. He's just mediocre to me. I liked him a little the first time he showed up in Season 1, but that's all. I don't really hate him for giving up the Mobilium Prime to Ingressus, because he obviously would have been killed if he hadn't, but I just wish he'd shown some remorse at some point. He very clearly doesn't care about anyone besides himself, and while I understand that's the point, I don't like careless characters who exist just for the sole purpose of being careless. That's why Solomon is so aggressively mediocre to me. His personality is pretty much just self-absorbed and a little eccentric. He's sort of comparable to Alistair, but whereas Alistair pains me on every possible level, Solomon just fills me with apathy. What more is there to say, really? He's just meh. That is all. Oh, and his death was hilarious. That's the most fun I ever had reading his character. Jalkar is a character I'm fairly conflicted on. I'm leaning a little towards saying I like him, but mostly towards the opposite. I did like him at first in the earlier half of Season 1 because his interactions with Grimm were fun and he himself was a pretty enjoyable character. He was a bad person for sure, but not a bad person to the point of being unlikable. But then episode 7 rolled around and he abandoned Grimm and he just progressively became worse and worse as if he wasn't already immoral enough. On the one hand, I appreciate that David went with an opposing arc to the classic bad guy thief gradually becomes a better person cliche because that did freshen up the story and make it a fair bit more realistic, but at the same time, it just wasn't that fun to watch. He's not poorly written at all. In fact, the way he's written makes perfect sense. I'm just not his biggest fan. He's okay, I guess. Honestly, Hassan is the most boring character in the entire series to me. There is nothing to describe about him. Who even cares what he says or does? He's just there. That's it. Moving on. Lucidius is more or less just a random Voltaris who tags along with the others throughout all 3 seasons. There is nothing of note about him whatsoever. I honestly forgot just how bland he is because of how great my friends have written him in their fanfictions. They do a good job at actually making him a more complex and likable character, but here, he's just a whole lot of nothing. Once again, not bad, but also not good. I do like the scene in Season 1, Episode 6 where he talks to Abigail, so there's that. Okay, next character. Onyx is a little mediocre. There's not much to say about him, but I guess I do like how he was actually the weakest of his Magnemite pack and puts on a tough facade now as a result. It's neat. Other than that, don't care, didn't ask plus ratio. Val is decent, and that's pretty much all I can say about her. She's sort of a fun character, but on the other hand, she just doesn't really get that much to do in the story, so she's nowhere near great. Props to her for being one of the only characters to actually acknowledge Gallius' death though. Like, what the actual hell? I'm still a little upset that most of them ignored that. Whatever, she's okay, moving on. Borgin, similar to Val, is the very definition of a perfectly fine, okay character. I don't have any strong opinions of him, but I do like him a little bit. His dynamic with Igneous is great, but then he just sort of exists for the remainder of the script after Igneous dies. He's still alright, simple as that. Masani is still in the decent category, but I honestly like her the most out of this group of characters. I like that she's mysterious and less talkative. I guess maybe I'm just a bit of a sucker for cat girls. Also, let me take this moment to derail the video entirely and talk about how I believe Masani and Lyra are very clearly meant to be a lesbian couple without it being explicitly stated in the script. I plead my case. Masani comments in this scene that she cares nothing for the kingdom of Felden, only a specific person living there, that person being Lyra. That's a bit sussy, but you know, I suppose you could argue that Lyra is just a close friend or a family member or someone of the sort. Alright, maybe, but then take into consideration that Masani was also banished from Felden for a completely ambiguous reason. Also note how Songs of War takes place in a medieval setting, and homosexuals weren't exactly treated with kindness and respect in real-life medieval times. I believe Masani and Lyra were in a secret gay relationship, and when Felden discovered this, they exiled Masani, punishing both of them by keeping them apart. Masani finds a new home in the Knights of Ardonia, and in the end, she comes back and saves Lyra's life in the Battle of Flora, and as a consequence, she dies herself, cradled in her lover's arms. This is my headcanon, and nobody is going to convince me that anything else is going on with these characters. Don't even try. Where was I again? Alright, the ranking. Alright, here's another hot take. If the first one wasn't enough, hear me out on this. Achillean is boring. In the year since I first read the script, I really Mandela affected myself into thinking Achillean, aka the Tidesinger, was a much better character than he actually was, because of how amazingly he was written in all my friends' fanfics. I absolutely adore those versions of him, but canon Achillean just isn't that great. He's far from bad, and he does have his moments, but overall, he's just kind of okay, in my opinion. The reason he's above all these other characters I consider decent is because the few good moments he does have are really good, but other than that, yeah, he's just alright. Throughout Season 1, Achillean is hyped up to be equally as important as Ingressus, aka the Death Singer. Makes sense, right? They were rivals. But then in Season 2 and 3, Achillean just isn't treated the same way Ingressus is treated by the script. Ingressus has an epic entrance in the finale of Season 1, and goes on to have a very powerful and notable presence in pretty much every scene he's in for the next 2 seasons. Whereas Achillean pops up out of nowhere midway through Season 2 and just kind of vibes with the Knights of Ardonia until he eventually dies. He feels like he's just another good guy in a group of good guys and doesn't seem that significant on his own. He doesn't accomplish anything individually, nor does he have anywhere near the presence his rival has. If you think about it, he isn't that distinct from Herobrine. Achillean is a really overpowered warrior who comes completely out of left field and helps the KOA fight the villains, showing up at random intervals to do so and occasionally chilling around if there's nothing else to do. Herobrine is a really overpowered warrior who comes completely out of left field and helps the KOA fight the villains, showing up at random intervals to do so and occasionally chilling around if there's nothing else to do. They have more or less the exact same role in the story. And if your cameo character, who is meant to be little more than a reference to your previous works, is equally as important as one of the supposed main characters of your story, then there's a problem with the script, for sure. Like I said before, Achillean does have his moments, and when he shines, he really shines. I like his conversation with Sen and this conversation with Gallius, where it's made clear through subtlety that he's conflicted about killing Ingressus. I also absolutely love his death scene in Season 3, Episode 5, and all the backstory and lore stuff about him was great too. But other than that, I just feel like Achillean was wasted for the most part. Again, you can always feel free to disagree with my opinions. Moving on. Yujuki is good. Not great, but good. She doesn't have that much to do in the story, but she's mostly an enjoyable character. I like her interactions with Kyoshi and how she has the internal conflict of serving a kingdom that isn't her homeland, but still having some unofficial dedication to her homeland at the end of the day. That was neat. Then again, I suppose a good portion of my opinion might be the Catgirl curse striking again. Alec is yet another character who I think is good and nothing more. I like how he looks up to Kyoshi in Season 1 and 2, and then sort of gives up on everything after Kyoshi dies, then finally regains the courage to sacrifice himself to save his kingdom at the end of Season 3. He is good, I like him, moving on. I know Saxon and Trevor are technically two characters, but it's really not possible to talk about them individually since they entirely hinge on their own dynamic. With that being said, they're both fun, enjoyable side characters who perfectly fit the role of comic relief within the Ender Knights. I like them a fair bit, enough said. Eddie is just a good, funny character. I love how he somehow survived the attack on the basalt mines way back in early Season 1 and came back only at the tail end of Season 3. Technically, there is no conceivable way he could have gotten out alive considering how drunk he is all the time. But honestly, I don't care. He's just charming enough for that to be forgiven in my eyes. Keep drinking those drinks, Eddie. I hate alcohol and I've already made a pledge to myself never to consume it recreationally, but he can go nuts. Zarya is fairly interesting to me. He has an intimidating presence in Season 1, and while I'm not really a fan of him being sidelined in Season 2, he does get justice in Season 3 with his semi-redemption arc where he helps Nika and Lucan defeat Scorch. All in all, a good character. I love Hawken. He's insignificant and dies almost immediately in the story, but he's great. I'm not even going to justify myself with words. I'm just going to prove my point with this clip.
Fear not, Thalius, for I am prepared to fight.
Herobrine has very little bearing on the overall story, and is clearly just in the series to nostalgia bait older BPS fans and pander to a certain subsection of the Minecraft community. With that being said, I really like him. While Herobrine wasn't really necessary, he wasn't a bad addition to the story by any means. He was pretty cool, to be honest, and while he could be called nostalgia bait for sure, I at least think it was executed decently for what it's worth. Good character, although kind of unneeded. That's all. I like Hubris quite a bit. He's definitely a flawed character because of his, well, hubris, but he's fun to read and undoubtedly a good person at heart. He's not fantastically written or anything, but he's definitely still fairly good. I love his interactions with Grek, which include some of the funniest jokes in the entire series, and even individually, he's at least moderately interesting. I absolutely love how they make it seem like he might follow the footsteps of Alistair and betray the Knights of Ardonia in Season 3, becoming corrupted by the allure of the Prime songs and trying to steal them for himself, and then he doesn't do that. Despite his boastful and prideful nature, Hubris is a good person who cares about those around him, so he never gives in the way you're led to believe he might, and that's a pretty satisfying subversion. I also love how in the finale, Hubris objects to Rhea's desire to use the Prime songs in battle, but not because he's a big condescending idiot who doesn't believe in her and just wants to oppose the popular opinion for the sake of creating conflict. Instead, he objects because he actually has a real, genuine motivation for doing so. He wants Rhea to be safe and is afraid of what may happen to her if she lets the allure of the Primes blind her, because he nearly suffered the same fate. I hate how this isn't even acknowledged by Rhea later on, even after his death, but that's not a problem with his character, it's a problem with hers. So all in all, Hubris is pretty gamin'. Moving on. Sen is also good. Not astoundingly so, but he does serve the role of a protagonist well enough to justify being in that role, and his journey throughout the 3 seasons is neat as heck. I love how he learns the errors of the things he was raised to believe in a fairly natural manner by interacting with his Voltaris brethren, and I like that he comes to understand his old mentor Fallius wasn't as perfect as he used to believe, but still continues to respect him for his kind soul and the impact he's had on his life. As far as my criticisms go with Sen's character, he doesn't stray too far from his basic archetype. A lot of what he learns is partially an excuse for exposition to be served to the reader, and the big reveal that he was in fact part Voltaris is highly predictable. I mean, it was obvious from the start that he would have had Voltaris heritage since it was necessary for his internal conflict. Speaking of which though, said internal conflict is handled pretty well in Season 3 when it's given a lot of focus. I love how Sen is torn between the family he was born with, that being the Voltaris, and the family he was raised by, that being the Sindaris. It's also a neat little subversion that Sen is half Voltaris and half Sindaris, although that does raise some interesting questions. Like, why haven't we heard of other hybrid Ardoni before this point? Presumably they're all biologically compatible, right? Have cross-clan relationships just never happened save for this one specific instance? To be fair, whatever. I don't know, it doesn't really matter, and it's not something the story needs to touch on at the end of the day. With all things considered, Sen, while not an extraordinary character by any means, is still good, bordering on great. I like Vulcanus a lot. He's definitely the best Natharan character by far. I enjoy his formal demeanor and his interactions with Abigail, although I absolutely do not ship them or see them as anything more than friends. Don't at me. But the part that really sells me is his dynamic with Pythus. Vulcanus does hate his brother for killing their father, but subtly, it seems like a part of him still does care about Pythus and hopes he can change for the better. Obviously, that doesn't happen, which only increases Vulcanus' internal struggles as he's forced to try and overthrow the last of his family in a desperate act to save his people from being led to their demise by their own king. Throughout Season 3, he musters up the courage to first get Abigail's help against Pythus and then rebel on his own, and when he gets that sweet victory against his brother in the finale, it truly feels earned. David once said Vulcanus was one of his favorite characters, and I can totally get why. He's not quite on that level for me, but he's definitely still really good. Props to you, David. You put a lot of effort into this very sophisticated Natharan, and I appreciate that. Grek is consistently one of the most fun characters to read, because of his hilarious tough guy quips and his dynamic with hubris, but also because of his tragic and emotional struggles of being lonely without another of his species to call his friend. It's genuinely really heartbreaking to learn his backstory, and it really invests you in his relationship with the other KOA members, who he sees as the only family he has. To me, Grek is a perfect example of how to write the perfect balance between a funny and a genuine, kind character with a tough demeanor. They really mastered his archetype. That's what I'll say. Moving on. I love Denny. He's just a sweet, wholesome boy who was whisked from his home because of his destiny as an Ender Knight, and now has to deal with the consequences, all while sticking to Abigail's side, seeing the best in everyone, except Alistair of course, and being a young hero everywhere he went. I find him special because he's just an average person who gave up a life of peace to do what he thought was right. It's absolutely tragic how he died in Season 3, Episode 5, but I think that highlights just how little Songs of War is afraid to kill even the most beloved characters. I respect that move a lot. It goes to show how even the most innocent and loving of people can perish in brutal war, and the effects such losses have on others, particularly Abigail in this case. Also, I ship Denigale over Volcanigale any day of the week, and that is a hill I will die on. Unless their ages are apart by a few years or more, in which case that's a huge no-no in my book. But the script doesn't really specify that, so I ultimately have no reason to assume they aren't roughly the same age. Back on topic, Denny is sweet, wholesome, and very good. Onward to the next character. Similar to Grek, Igneous is a character who manages to be simultaneously hilarious and compelling throughout his role in the story. He first starts off as a comic relief character, but not just that, he's also living evidence that the preconceived notions about Magnarites being tough and dangerous in the minds of both the viewers and the other characters were in fact not entirely true. It's not exactly deep, but it's at worst serviceable exploration of the themes of prejudice, and I like it a lot. Later on, Igneous' mission to end the war between Cydonia and Carfin is incredibly gripping, and I was cheering for him to win the entire time. Of course, he eventually sacrifices himself for peace and takes down Malachi in the process, and I think that was the perfect way to end his character. Not only is it emotional, it brings his arc to its completion in a bittersweet manner. Igneous may be dead now, but when he was alive, he faced discrimination and felt like he had no home either inside or outside Carfin. And now, because of his heroic actions, he has changed the future for the better and ensured that other Magnarites will not have to feel like that again. A great send-off to a great character. Enough said. I am very much a Nitsuki enjoyer. A cat girl is one thing, but a shy and relatable cat girl? Now that's how you get me hooked on a character. In all seriousness though, Nitsuki is indeed great. She first exists as a plot device to show how little the other kingdoms care about the war Feldon is fighting against the Necromancers, seeing as Northwind was only willing to send not even a chronicler, but a chronicler in training to document the conflict instead of reinforcing Feldon with more troops. And she could have been a perfectly fine plot device and never done anything else, but then the script decided to make her even better by giving her proper characterization as an awkward but passionate lover of history, and having her interact with Kiyoshi, leading to one of my favorite scenes in the entire second season, where they talk to each other about their respective struggles. In fact, I loved it so much that me and my friend Infin Girl wrote an entire fanfiction shipping the two of them called So Much in Common, which I really hope you aren't looking up right now because in retrospect, it's a little embarrassing, not gonna lie. Actually, you know what? Screw that. I ship Kyuki, and I'll say that with pride. They're just so fundamentally perfect together that it's unreal. God bless you, David and Badger, for having these two interact in that one scene and sparking one of my favorite ships of all time as a consequence. Right up there with Lumity, which, mind you, is my favorite ship in any cartoon I've ever watched. That alone is enough to rank Nitsuki high on this list. Plain and simple. You see, Lucan is your typical Han Solo-esque good but not necessarily lawful mercenary archetype. You would think this would make him generic, but nah, he's still a really enjoyable character who is made even better by the other characters around him, while enhancing them in the process as well. Lucan is the perfect foil to Kiyoshi, for instance. While they aren't enemies, their personalities clash in just about every way. Both are inherently good people, but while Kiyoshi is explicitly lawful, Lucan is not. He'll do things his own way and rebel against authority if he thinks it's the right decision. Lucan also values individual people, while Kiyoshi values the majority of people, which can be seen when Lucan argues with Kiyoshi in this scene about rescuing Nika from the necromancers. And speaking of Nika, by far the best part about Lucan is his whole dynamic with everyone's favorite tsundere catgirl. It's a perfect balance between lighthearted fun and quips and a serious, emotional bond that progresses naturally throughout all 3 seasons. I do have to criticize Lucan's writing for one thing, which is the fact he doesn't seem to acknowledge Kiyoshi's death despite their history, but meh, whatever, it's not that big of a deal. Overall, Lucan is a great and fun character and remains that way throughout the whole story. A lot of what I already said when talking about Lucan can also be said to explain why I really like Nika. It may or may not in part be because she's a catgirl, but what I can tell you for certain is that she's a really great character with simple yet well done motivations and a good amount of development to come with. I really do enjoy her more spunky and aggressive personality because it contrasts Lucan's much more laid back demeanor greatly and leads to some really funny interactions in all 3 seasons. Nikan is one of my absolute favorite ships from the show, and I have to say, it was great seeing both characters come together in the end, even if a kiss would have looked absolutely awful in the Minecraft animation. Another aspect of Nika's character that I really like is how she is determined to destroy the necromancers, and is initially against the idea of helping Zarya in Season 3 because he used to be one. But eventually she accepts that the necromancers no longer exist, and that Zarya is off doing his own thing now. It's nice, and just like Zarya, she finds peace with Lucan once the Nether is gone and Felden is safe. A great end to the arc of a great character. Enough said. Grimm is by far the least hateable character in Songs of War. While nowhere near being the best, he gets a high spot on this ranking because of how hilarious and wholesome he is. If you don't like Grimm, I really have to ask, who hurt you? How can you look at this guy and hear his little grunts, and not at least appreciate him? He's always been a fan favorite, and I can see why. From his interactions with Jalkar way back in Season 1 to his days in the KOA, Grimm is ironically the opposite of what his name would suggest, lively and full of positive energy, and possibly the funniest character in the whole series. What else is there to say, really? Grimm is great. Moving on. Thalius earns a high spot on this list by being the center of the Thalius own brand Peas gag, and that is all. Okay fine, I'll actually explain. Thalius is a very controversial character, and it's easy to see why. On the one hand, he is clearly a kind-hearted soul and cares deeply for the people around him throughout the first half of Season 1 until his death. On the other hand, he also has many skeletons in his closet, having gone on various missions to hunt down and kill Voltaris for seemingly no reason beyond the fact that they are Voltaris, and the Ardoni just don't like them. This adds a level of moral ambiguity to his character for sure, but the best part of said moral ambiguity is, well, the ambiguity. We learn of Thalius' actions, but never the true motivations behind them, nor do we learn of how he felt while doing them. He's such an interesting character, mostly if not entirely because of the fan discussions he provokes. One could argue Thalius never truly wanted to hunt down and kill innocent Voltaris, but was under pressure to do so because of the prejudice in Ardoni society and the desires of the masters above him. And while that would be a perfectly fair assumption to make, we also don't know that for sure. It's very open-ended, which inherently leads to fan discourse and interpretation, and makes him a much more interesting character than he would be otherwise. So props to David and Badger, I think they pulled that off really well. Even if you strip all that away, you're still left with a very enjoyable character with an incredible voice actor and a truly epic aura. Thalius was my favorite way back when I first watched Season 1, and while he's been knocked down quite a few pegs since then, he still takes a high spot on this list as one of my favorites. It was honestly tough to decide whether to rank Gallius above or below Thalius. Thalius is a little more interesting due to his moral ambiguity, but I still think Gallius is superior overall. Like Thalius, he is a kind and inspiring mentor to Sen and other characters throughout Season 2 and 3, but he also opposes his brother in many ways that distinguish the two of them and make it apparent that they are not the same. A neat little example I would like to mention is how Thalius is very big on the usage of songs and encourages younger Ardoni like Sen and Ria to use them, but he also provides vague warning of the risks by talking about the adverse effects on his health from his overuse of songs. This runs slightly but not entirely parallel to Gallius' distaste for songs in general, and his belief that their allure of power can corrupt even the most kind souls if they lack the will to resist control. I like that. Overall, Gallius is a little higher than Thalius, more or less because he has more time in the script, and I like his much more peaceful demeanor. I wish I could say more in regards to that point, but I genuinely don't know if I can think of anything else, so let's just move on to the top 3, the trio of whom I consider to be the absolute best characters from Songs of War, in my own subjective opinion. Captain Yoshi of the Felden Guard is my favorite character in the entire series. Is he my choice for the best character of all? No, but he is my personal favorite. I just love everything about this guy. His voice, his design, his slightly but not overly smug attitude, his dedication to his people and his kingdom, his subtle care for Lucan despite their differences, his emotional struggles about having to live up to the legacy of his father and grandfather before him, the very realistic portrayal of imposter syndrome intertwined with his role in the story, his absolute gut-wrenching defeat and death in Season 2 Episode 8, and of course, his non-canon relationship with Nutsuki, which I still get crazy over to this day. I could really just gush about how much I love Kiyoshi for hours, but I can't waste that much of your time. To put it simply, I once said over a year ago that if I was within the world of Songs of War, of legal age, and not straight, I would date him in a heartbeat. Well, guess what? That statement still applies, but with one less restriction, because I've since come out as bisexual. In other words, I'm not straight. Kiyoshi is just the ideal boyfriend. There is no disputing this. In fact, can I get some agreements in the comments section? And can I have this video shared to every Kiyoshi fan in the community so they can agree as well? Trust me, it'd be greatly appreciated. I need some other opinions here, because I cannot begin to justify how much I adore this character and everything about him. I should really make an entire video someday, but for now, I'll leave it at that, and move on to the two characters I don't like quite as much, but still find better nonetheless. Remember when I said at the beginning of this video how Abigail is an incredibly compelling character with astounding development and minimal problems back when I was talking about Rhea? Well, unsurprisingly, I still stand by that opinion. And the thing that confuses me is that very few people in the community seem to agree. In fact, Abigail is a primary target of some of the most absurd bad faith criticisms I've ever heard. People like to say she's a bad character because, plot armor, I guess. That's the main critique I've heard of her, and here's what I'll say to that. I will not deny that Abigail has a bit of plot armor. That is true to an extent. However, it is mostly if not entirely inconsequential and does not ruin her character in the slightest. In fact, I think that despite this occasional plot armor, she is still the second strongest character in the entire series, with possibly the most developed arc and more layers of personality than anyone else. Let me list off just a few examples of internal struggles Abigail goes through. Just like Kiyoshi, she has to deal with a severe amount of imposter syndrome, believing she isn't good enough to fit her destiny as the Ender Queen. The script also explores how she cares deeply about the other Ender Knights and feels responsible for anything that happens to them, to the point of losing faith in herself when something bad happens to her friends, with the most prominent example of this being Denny's death midway through Season 3. We see Abigail struggle to prove herself, and then realize she doesn't have to be as perfect as she was made out to believe by her destiny. Rather, she just has to have her heart in the right place and do the right thing, and her friends and others will stand by her side anyway. Focusing on that last point a little more, there is one scene towards the end of Season 3 that truly encapsulates just how excellent Abigail is as a character, and how well written her arc is. She takes the Ender Trials to prove herself worthy of defeating the Nether, and completes multiple of them, only to fail on what is presumably the last trial. At first, she lets this ruin her self-esteem, and she comes close to giving up, but knowing she still has to do what's right, even if she isn't perfect, she gets back up and fights the Nether anyway, proving herself as a hero, not through the completion of some arbitrary trial, but through her own actions. A more generic character arc would most likely end with her overcoming that one specific flaw and coming back to complete the trial properly, but not Abigail's, because the point is that she doesn't need to fix that one specific flaw, nor does she need to pass the trial to be the hero she's destined to be. What matters is that she's doing what's right and giving it everything she has. She isn't perfect, and that's okay. Her imperfections won't stop her from saving the world. She makes her own trial, and she passes it by saving the world in her own way, and I think that is downright amazing, and it sends a message to people that I wholeheartedly believe everyone needs to hear. This all sounds wonderful, right? I certainly think so, which is why it sucks to see Abigail's character constantly being reduced to a so-called Mary Sue because certain fans are completely overlooking everything I just mentioned. She isn't without her problems, in fact, I'll mention some right now. I do wish they had taken some time to explore her inner conflict about the killing of others, like Jalkar for instance, because that would have added yet another layer of complexity to her character. Like a lot of other people, I also find it incredibly stupid that she got revived by End Crystals twice. The first time it was fine because End Crystals healing someone makes perfect sense given the context of what they do in the game, but then once the exact same thing happens again in the battle against Pyphis, it just feels lame. Why not have Pyphis destroy the End Crystals and raise the stakes of that fight? Whatever man, it's a minor nitpick really. Even if you account for these problems, and even if you take away points for them, you're still left with a very compelling and frankly underappreciated character, who I honestly came very close to putting in the number 1 spot on this list. But there is one character who I think is superior, and without further ado, we will now be talking about said character who has claimed number 1 spot on my ranking. It's the Death Singer. Honestly, what can I even say? David put everything he had into Ingressus, and it shows. He is pretty much everything I could ask for in any antagonist ever. Not only is he my favorite villain in the series by an insane margin, considering that every other villain ranges from mediocre to awful, he is one of my favorite villains in fiction, period. I cannot even begin to describe everything great about him. For starters, I've mentioned before in this video that he has a distinct and intimidating presence in virtually every scene he's in. At no point does he feel like he's taking the backseat to anyone else, and at no point does he feel like he has no impact on the events in his nearby vicinity, which is unfortunately not the case for Achillean, but we already went over that. Every time Ingressus shows up, I can feel it deep in my soul. He not only leaves an impression on the other characters, he leaves an impression on all of us as we watch him and read his dialogue. If that's the case, you know something is being done right. But in addition, David also nailed the sympathetic aspect to the Death Singer's character. Now, Ingressus is not morally good. That much is hard to debate. His actions were definitely crossing the line, understandable to an extent, but still not justified. That's the thing though, as unjustifiable as his actions are, you can still see his perspective, and you can see why he may think differently. When writing a sympathetic villain, your goal should not necessarily be to make the reader think they're in the right, but more so to make the reader understand why they think they're in the right, through exploring the situation through their perspective. A badly written, quote-unquote, sympathetic villain will likely be excused or justified by the story simply because they have a tragic past or some noble motive behind their otherwise despicable actions. A well-written sympathetic villain will still be held accountable by the story for what they did, but their side of things would be acknowledged and allow the reader to understand them to a degree. Despite what you may think by his actions in the finale of Season 3, Ingressus did not die a hero when he fought Pythus. He was never at any point the hero of the story, but he did die fighting for his people in what he believed to be a noble cause, and that was worthy of at least an ounce of respect. Does that mean what he did in the past was okay? Does it mean he was a good person? No to both, and he still would rightfully have faced the consequences for his actions had he lived. The only reason he didn't was because he died, and since he was no longer a threat to anyone in death, it only made sense to at least let his last wish be achieved. That wish being a bright future for his people, under the leadership of Sen. In the end, he gives up his title to Sen because he knows that even if he survives, there is still no making up for what he's done. He knows that despite his noble sacrifice, it still doesn't erase his wrongdoings, and it still doesn't make him any less of a villain. So he leaves the fate of his people in the hands of someone he knew was the true hero he had failed to be himself. And in my opinion, that is hands down some of the best writing I have ever seen for any villain. It is shocking to me how Ingressus was written by the same person who wrote Alistair, but I guess that's just what happens when you prioritize certain characters over others. And for what it's worth, I'm glad David put everything he had into Ingressus, because it paid off remarkably. I've still only scratched the surface of just how amazing he was, but honestly, I can't even go any further. It's just that indescribable. For all these reasons, without a shred of doubt, Ingressus is my personal pick for the best character in all of Songs of War. In conclusion, Songs of War has a massive selection of characters, ranging dramatically from the good to the bad, but upon revisiting the series, I can confidently say that while there were some notable disappointments, I still enjoyed the majority of these characters, and the lucky few who are given the most priority shine even harder than they did when I first read the script a year ago. Songs of War isn't perfect, and that's okay. It's still Songs of War, and it's still special to me, and when it gets good, it gets really good, even after every flaw. In the end, no matter what, I still love it, and while not all his writing was superb, I still respect David greatly for bringing it to light. Watching Songs of War, reading the script, and being in the community was a life-changing experience for me from the beginning, and after a journey of 2 entire years, I am still just as proud to call myself a fan as I was when my curious 14-year-old self clicked on episode 1 way back in the old days. Oh, if only I knew just how far I'd come. Remember, this list only consists of my personal opinions, and I seek not to offend or upset those who disagree or think differently. I strongly encourage calm, open discussion. Feel free to leave a comment if you want to add a thought of your own, and also feel free to like, subscribe, and share the video. Every action means so much to me, and I couldn't thank you enough if you took the time to show your support. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for what comes next because it's going to be pretty epic in its own right. With that out of the way though, see you next time, and bye!